Now for a very important game for the fate of the Women's Olympiad in Istanbul 2012. This was from the Russia-China match between Kozenteva and Zhao Yu. The Kozenteva sisters actually, I find, are both very well versed in effectively all the openings which they play, and I've noticed several instructive Ruy Lopez encounters, which I think repay close study. In this particular game, we get to consider the pawn structure which arises when white pushes d5 in response to c5 from black, and do it without looking at too much theory because it's a slightly offbeat line. So the game began with a Breyer Ruy Lopez, so with knight b8. And here at d4, knight d7, knight d2, bishop c2, rook e8. So this is all standard. And now this apparently was a continuation which was shown by Dekoyan to the Kozenteva sisters about a year before this game. Not the main line here, but an interesting one nonetheless. And here black decided to seek to fix the central pawn structure with c5, which is a move which has been played a little bit, but in principle I don't really like. The reason being that after white plays d5, black's idea is to play c4, so creating this square for the knight, and also preparing after white plays b4 to take this pawn en passant. If c4 isn't played, then white could play c4 himself, for instance, after, or herself in this instance, perhaps after b3. So c4 is the idea, but after white plays b4, black struggles to find a completely convincing response. As Kozenteva notes, a5, a4 is in white's favour in this position, and the alternative, which is to take on b3, allows white to recapture with the a pawn. So because black didn't wait for white to play a4, white has this additional structural response, and now the white pawn structure is just better than the black pawn structure, because white has one pawn island. Black has a target on a6, and the white pawn structure is just quite effective. Once white pushes with c4, she'll have consolidated her central space advantage, and also limited the bishop on b7. So we'll see that in a couple of moves. So after rook c8, bishop d3, knight b6. Bishop f1 is a move which Kozenteva criticizes, and she suggests that simply queen e2 is the simplest response. And after knight fd7, c4, takes, knight c5. Bishop a5, white's position is extremely comfortable. This bishop exerts very unpleasant pressure on the a5, d8 diagonal. The a6 pawn is a constant weakness. The b7 bishop is really struggling for space and scope, and white would have a very comfortable advantage here. Now the game, there's a lot of interesting content in the game, but it goes on for another 50 moves, and it's slightly beyond our purposes to consider it. Kozenteva gives very detailed instructive notes, which you can find in Megabase, but for our purposes, I think the useful thing to appreciate is just the structural considerations. So this structure arising after a takes b3 tends to be in white's favour, again because she can play c4 and has one pawn island. The alternative for black, which is a little bit more flexible, is to play bishop g7, to wait for white to play a4 and now play c5, which has the significant difference that after d5 c4 here, the white a pawn isn't on a2, so white isn't able to recapture on b3 with a pawn. Now that said, b4 here is probably still white's most promising move. Takes, bishop takes, and we can see that the pawn structure is fundamentally different, in that white also has certain queenside weaknesses. It isn't going to be as easy to achieve c4, for instance, and the play becomes considerably more dynamic. Kazanteva notes that after knight c5, c4, queen d7, bishop a5 is an interesting move, planning to bring the bishop back to c2 and protecting the e4 pawn, and then to maneuver the knight around perhaps to e3. This is a position in which black is under some strategic threat of being squeezed, again because the bishop on b7 is quite passive, and it's notable that after the further moves, rook c8, bishop c2 takes and knight d2. This position has been reached a couple of times in practice, including by the other Kazanteva on the black side of this position, and in both games, black has felt compelled to give up a piece for a mobile central pawn mass. White bishop takes d5, takes knight b7, followed by knight takes d5, with certain dynamic compensation. So that's been reached in Balogh, Michalewski, and also Sabag against Tatiana Kazanteva. But these games, again, you can find them in the database. But I think just illustrate the different structure which arises in seemingly a similar variation, but because white is committed to a4, the position becomes much sharper, and it's harder for white to consolidate his d5 pawn. And again, it seems strange to suggest that the d5 pawn needs to be consolidated. But because black very frequently sacrifices a piece for these two central pawns, in fact, the d5 pawn does need to be bolstered, and getting a white pawn to c4 is a very effective way to do that. So these positions, in particular, I think the Breyer is probably one of the most complex of the Ruy Lopez variations being used at the moment, which is one of the reasons for its popularity. And it tends to hinge on a lot of quite subtle strategic nuances. But certainly here, in terms of if black wants to play with c5, I think it's strategically much safer to wait for white to play a4, and then to strike with c5 with a very interesting play.